This is Talking Drupal, chat about web design and development by a group of guys with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode number 160, Config Split. How you guys doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Great. Today we're talking about config split, which will be fun. I know that's been on John's list of things to chat about for quite a while, so we finally get to that today.
Yep, looking forward to it.
I'm Stephen Cross, and joining me as usual, we have John Picozzi from Oomph. Hey, John.
Good afternoon. You'll notice that I'm well lit today.
You are well lit.
If you're watching
now,
via
what does that
video.
exactly mean?
Well, we're
the lighting is good.
He's been hiding in the shadows in the last couple episodes.
The window has daylight coming through it, is what that means.
That's true, and that is clearly because we're doing this during the day. And I want to thank you guys again for being very flexible. My schedule has been crazy the last 2 months, but I think all that is behind us, and we're going to get back to some normal kind of recording now. So I really appreciate your flexibility.
No problem.
So also joining us is Nick Laughlin from Enlightened Development.
Yeah, you can see the light come through my window too. My window's actually open. You know, it's February 21st. It's nearly 70 degrees out. So I figured I'd get some fresh air in the house, and it's a nice day outside.
Yeah, it is a great day. Actually a little cloudy here. I'm not sure. It's not 70 where we are, where John and I are, I don't think.
It's warmer. It's warmer down here. I don't know if it's 70 though. Haven't been outside yet.
Hey, before we start talking about Drupal 8 configuration, I did want to touch on a couple of things. One is, I don't know if you guys follow Dries's blog, which you can find at www.dri.es. Very clever URL. He posted a blog post back on January 1st or 2nd entitled More Blogging and Less Social Media. It was him basically like his New Year's kind of blog post that says, hey, this year I'm going to try to get back to doing more blogging and less tweeting and less posting on Facebook. And kind of what's interesting about that, and I read that post back in January, and I recommend people go take a look at it. It brings up a lot of interesting points about problems with Facebook and social media over the past, really in 2017, things that came to light. And with really the recent news with the elections and Russia getting involved, and in the recent news also that Facebook has been taking some hits with user count, users signing up. They've lost a few million people, I guess, in the last quarter, and their engagement numbers are also dropping. So there's a lot of shakeup going on at Facebook and in social media. And I kind of think that 2018 is going to be the year of people reevaluating their social media strategy. I know it's something, not that I ever had a strategy, but I know that I've made changes to my Facebook account by basically unfriending everyone. So those of you out there who haven't noticed that, I've kind of gotten rid of that side of it. The one thing I do like about Facebook, I belong to a few Facebook groups. And if it weren't for those groups, those private groups that I belong to, I probably would just deactivate my account, I think.
Yeah, I think
go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think it's pretty interesting too, because I went through a somewhat similar, a little bit different, but similar process to you and Dries. I hadn't seen that particular article until you shared it, but I saw the same news about, the interference and how Facebook has been handling that. And based on things I've read, they've handled it pretty poorly. I've read some recent reports about, there's some new laws in Germany and the EU that are going to severely impact Facebook, because basically the basic law is just that people have a right to privacy, and that websites can't track information for themselves or third parties without explicit permission. And there's some extremely hefty fines if they do that. And Facebook tracks everything and everyone, whether or not you have an account. And so thinking about that, thinking about privacy, I actually went through something similar. I deleted Facebook off my phone about 6-8 weeks ago. And I think I noticed two things. One was the amount of email I get from Facebook shot up dramatically, like almost desperate, like trying to get me to come back. I mean, I didn't delete Facebook. I didn't stop visiting it on the computer. I just deleted it off my phone. The only other thing I noticed was that I post less, because one of the things I liked about Facebook on the phone was that I could post a picture or a funny status update or something. I also went through and cleaned house. I deleted a bunch of information, like things like that I liked. In anticipation of thinking about deleting it, there's an option on Facebook to download your data. And so I took advantage of that because, I have a lot of pictures on there and that kind of stuff. And so it's a very handy link. You click it, it gives you about 10 minutes and then it downloads everything. The interesting thing though, is that they also give you a lot of information about things that they track. So like they show, here's all the groups here. Like there's a page called ads and it shows you every single ad topic that they put you on. There's a list of the advertisers that they've shared your contact information with. There's a list of
information is available to you when you download it.
Yep. Yeah. So like for example,
you could stick in the show notes a link to maybe a resource that you use to learn how to do that.
Yeah, I can. It was very easy. And it shows how much stuff that they track. And so I still haven't decided yet if I'm going to delete Facebook. I mean, it's a convenient way to keep in touch with some people that are geographically distant. Right, so I probably won't delete it yet, but I've certainly taken some steps to kind of reclaim it. I think it's really interesting. What Dries has posted was that, one of the things I really liked was that he's going to start posting similar to Facebook on his own blog so that you can still have an outlet.
His point, I mean, you kind of diverted into some of the privacy issues, which really isn't what Dries's point was about. And not the one I was actually trying to make today, but it is a great one to talk about at some point. But his was more like reclaiming your content. Is that instead of and that post that he did on January 2nd was him sort of kicking around this thought, and then he's had a number of blog posts followed up since that. About a month later, beginning of February, he had a follow up, and then has had 3 or 4 since then of what he's doing and the strategy he's taken. It's really more of, I think, reclaiming his content, and not that it doesn't go on Facebook, and not that he deleted his Facebook account. But what he did do is he's now being the canonical source of his content is his blog, the way we all thought it should be all along. And then social media, I think, kind of sucked a lot of us in, where people using that as their primary posting point and then syndicating back to their blog. He's now proposing the opposite, or moving back to the opposite, where his content will all come in on his blog and then go out through social media from that point. There's a number of articles there, a number of posts that he's put. It's been something he's clearly been focusing on the last few weeks. So if you don't subscribe to his blog, you probably should take a look at it. He's always got something interesting to say. And I would love to talk more about the Facebook privacy and social media privacy things at some point.
I'm willing to bet that nobody that listens to this podcast, or everybody that listens to this podcast, is probably already looking at Dries's blog. I'm just going out on a limb there.
Yeah, I think so.
I don't think anybody's not doing that.
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, I would say, I mean, I've been to his blog and I read it fairly often, but I wouldn't say I follow it. I mean, it's usually somebody posts something about it. Like, I don't go to his site and look for updates. It's usually
wait a second
somewhere else.
You go to his blog based on a link you've got from social media?
No, well, yes, or in this case from the show notes.
And we've come full circle.
Sure. I'm just curious, is anyone using RSS Reader these days? I still do. That's where anything that I keep up with, I go to on a daily basis to get my information. Does anyone still do that? Or am I a dying breed?
I look at Facebook for entertainment, and I look at Twitter for interesting articles and stuff that I might want to follow up on.
I do not use an RSS feeder. I never did. I know Google Reader used to be pretty good, but I'm pretty sure Google killed that. I think actually, you know what? I did use Google Reader once. I heard about it, signed up for a couple things, and then Google shut it down about a week later. So I haven't jumped back on the RSS feed train.
Interesting. Maybe I should make a blog post of how I use RSS Reader and then syndicate that to Facebook and Twitter. All right, let's move on to Drupal 8 configuration management. I think we're going to start with a little bit about that and then move on to our primary topic today, which is config split.
Yeah, so a little bit of history. Drupal 8, as most people on the show listening to the show know, is a huge rewrite of the Drupal code base. And in order to coordinate that, there were several big initiatives to kind of give a committee some control over and a guiding force behind making some decisions. And one of the initiatives was the Configuration Management Initiative. And I think its purpose was to help solve the problem of deploying a site and making sure that you can track it in version control. It was kind of trying to solve some of the same space that features in Drupal 7 did, but not, that wasn't its only area of concern. It didn't end up being a full replacement for features. It replaced a lot of what features did. It replaced a lot of the strong arm and variable stuff. So to give you a little bit of contrast, configuration management generally is for moving between different environments of the same website. So if you're looking to move stuff between different sites, like on a distribution or something, then features still kind of holds place there.
Well, I think features is really doing what its initial intent was too, is to package things together to create some functionality that you can deploy to certain places.
Correct.
And while that sounds the same as configuration management, it's not. Configuration management is more of taking your configuration. So when we say configuration, like the fields in a view, if you change them in your development environment, you don't want to have to go manually make those changes to your testing environment. You basically move that stuff, save it out in code, and import it through code to your testing environment, and those changes get applied.
Yeah, I think the big and Nick did bring this up. I think the big difference here is configuration, as you said, Steve, is between the same site, the development, staging, production. Where features comes in is you can share a feature between different sites. So, you have a cool thing that you did, you want to share it with somebody, you can package it up as a feature and ship it off. Yeah. Configuration doesn't easily work like that, and I don't think the original intent was for it to be used in that way.
I think some of the confusion comes from too is that's how people use features. I mean, I haven't used the features module on a single Drupal 8 site, and that's because the only time I use features generally was to push up configuration to a specific site. And so configuration management now solves that problem, but features still has a place. It's just something that doesn't need to be used as often because it's not, there's a core way to do what people were using it for.
It also, the big issue between we have some Drupal 7 sites that we support, and the biggest issue right now, and you hear all of our developers grumbling because they've worked in Drupal 7, they've used configuration management, they go back to Drupal or they've gone to Drupal 8, they've used config management, they go back to Drupal 7 and they're like, I got to do this like 3 times. I have to create the field on dev, test it, I got to create the field on stage to show the client, and then I got to create it on production for the live environment. This solves that in a lot of cases.
So John, at your company, then you didn't adopt features as a mechanism to manage configuration in Drupal 7?
No.
As a standard? Okay.
No, the consensus was that the amount of overhead that features causes and the amount of like kind of prior knowledge to as how features was set up would actually be slower than just doing it doing certain tasks in three places.
Yeah, one of the major drawbacks of features was as soon as you have more than one developer working on it, it becomes way easier to get conflicts and other issues, whereas configuration management tends to handle that a lot easier.
Yeah.
So this little debate, by the way, I don't know if you guys remember episode 104 of Talking Drupal. We have an episode called Feature Debate, where you could hear us having a detailed discussion about this exact topic. That'd be talkingdrupal.com/104.
About how I absolutely despise features. Yes, listen to that. You'll understand my feelings on features.
Right.
They are very evident. But this show is not that show. So configuration management, I mean, the greatest thing here is it brings your configuration into code, right? So we all are, well, most of us, I won't say all, are running, Git repos. And the other part of this is that when you add a field to a Drupal 7 site, that field is stored in the database. It's not stored in code. So there's no, unless you're taking database dumps, database backups, there's no really easy way to kind of recover that if something goes awry. And if there's a database corruption of some sort, then you're going to be looking at backups for that. Well, this allows you to actually export your config from your Drupal 8 site into code that you can actually then check into your repository. So what we're doing at Oomph is, through our code review process, if you're making a change, you're exporting your config, and then you're importing it into, or you're committing it in your PR to the repo, and then that's getting reviewed by somebody, and somebody's going through and saying, yeah, this config makes sense, or no, it doesn't.
Yeah, I guess not to get too far diverted, I think one thing that I've noticed, which it has to happen to work, is that sometimes you make a few changes and you go to dump that config and commit it, and you think, oh, I only made a couple of changes, and you end up with 14 files changed, 3 deleted, and 10 brand new ones that are created.
Yeah.
So sometimes it gets a little overwhelming.
As you do it more and more, on that note, I will say, as you do it more and more, you start to understand, like, when you make a change, how many different pieces of configuration are affected. You enable a module, maybe that module has a setting section that goes with it, or maybe it adds a permission, or maybe it does some other thing. And that list kind of gets exponentially larger if you're doing a multilingual site, because there's a whole multilingual component to it. But it's interesting because when you do your imports or your exports, you start to understand a little bit more about how Drupal's saving the config and the different config files that you may have.
Having that as part of a code review process is really good, because oftentimes, I don't know if you've experienced this, John, when you take a look at the config file, you'll see something in there and go, wait a minute, I didn't actually intend to make that change. And it could be just because when you were developing, you did something somewhere that really you forgot you did. It ends up in the config, and you go through the code review and you see something in there and it goes, oh, wait a minute.
So two things on that, right? Early on in config management and config synchronization, some modules would actually enter null values into the config, which could potentially, depending on where those null values are, could break things. So code review would, in most cases, catch those. But the other thing there is making sure you're not doing a git add -a, right? Because that's just going to add all of your config, good, bad, and indifferent, to your commit. So doing the git add -p allows you to go through line by line, and sometimes you're just hitting yes, like, yes, I edited this file, put it in there. But you can review those individual segments of the config to get kind of your what you've done, and it's a great review exactly of like, hey, did I actually want to do this? Did I actually want to commit this permissions change or commit this this enabling of a module? That's another thing that's stored in config is all your enabled modules. So you can see anytime you enable a module, the core extensions configuration file gets updated, and you can see that module's been turned on. And it's great to be able to see that, like, yes, I did enable this module, or oh gee, shouldn't be enabling devel on the production. Let me go back and update that.
Yeah, I mean, another tip is to make sure you're committing the config changes quite often, so you don't, like, if you develop for a few days and then go do something else, then come back to a project and do some more development, and then have to commit configuration changes to get it up. Suddenly you have 75 files to look at from a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I mean, that all gets back to how are you, how small your commits, are they really individual?
I try to commit.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Just like regular code changes, you want to try to make commits as often as possible.
Commit often, yes.
Commit often, yep. Commit cleanly. All right, so I think that's a good precursor to getting to what config split does, right? There is a problem that config split, which is the module we're talking about, is going to solve. What is that problem, John?
So a lot of times, what you'll see is you'll see that. For example, a really great example. Let me start with an example because it might be a little bit easier to visualize. On your production server, right, you have Google Analytics installed, and you have a Google ID. Well, you don't want that Google ID to apply to your dev and your stage environments because it's not really necessary there. Or if you did want to test that, you may have like a test or a dev ID. What config split does is it actually allows you to split your configuration based on the environment that you're working on. And this will allow you to set that Google Analytics ID to the production value, and then either shut it off for development and staging, or set development and staging values. You can choose which way you want to go. We typically use this also with the devel module. Devel module is turned on for our local environments and our development environments, but it's shut off in staging and production. Cache settings is another one that I typically use config split with. XML sitemap. So you actually find a lot of different use cases.
File proxy. I mean,
the list goes on, right? You can think of a whole bunch of things that you're like, hey, well, I use coffee in production because it's helpful. So, but you can see a whole list of things that you're like, oh, I need this in my development environment. I need this in my local environment. I don't really want it in my staging environment. The other thing that we do is we've updated the site names. So that way, when you load the site, you can actually see right in the tab that, hey, this is the stage. This is the local. It's loading the local config. It's loading the stage config. It's loading the production config. So it's super, super helpful in that regard.
I just wanted to make one minor, slightly pedantic correction. Config split allows you to change how the configuration is, but it's not based on environment. It's based on whatever you want it to be, essentially. Like, there's a variable, you can just select it, and there's a variable you can set in settings.php. 99% of use cases, it's going to be based on environment. It's going to be dev, stage, live, or local, something else. But it's not restricted to environment. It's restricted to whatever your use cases are.
That is true. It's configured by a setting in your settings.php file, and
in
the database. So
can you take me through? I haven't used the module, so I'm a good person to ask some questions here. Take me through how this thing is set up. Am I sitting in my dev environment, setting my variables for all of the other?
Yeah, so that's actually,
or am I doing them in the place that the split is set up?
So that's a great question. So let's start from the beginning. First of all, you have your configuration synchronization. You turned on config management and core. You're doing all that stuff. You download and install the config split module. And then you can, once you've enabled it, it adds a configuration split setting under your development menu in Drupal. You can go in there and you can set up your splits. So typically what we do is we set up a local split, a development split, a staging split, and a production split. Now, Nick's right. You can activate those splits through the UI. So if you are, a site builder and you only want to do it through the UI, you can enable and change those splits through the UI and determine which ones are active. We actually do it through the settings.php file because part of our deployment script changes those variables to make sure the right split is active when the site is deployed. So we're using Jenkins to update that settings.php file and make sure the right split is enabled.
Well, yeah, let's also, I wanted to mention a use case that I think where doing it through UI could make sense too, because I kind of follow a generally same pathway as you, where, dev and production have, their own, the variable set in settings of PHP so that it automatically gets set. But let's say, for example, you have a situation where every quarter you need to run a process on the site, and that involves creating a temporary content type and importing some content, running some function, and then you don't need any of that. That data gets put somewhere else. You don't need it anymore. So you have like a migration split where somebody, and it's sensitive data, so you don't want it. You don't want that stuff on the site all the time. So you would have somebody go in, turn the migration split on, run the process. It imports to the content types that are now created, all that stuff. Process runs. Then you can just turn that split off, and all that content gets shut off, and permissions go away. So you can use it for situations that aren't just environment based; they're function based, functionality based.
When I'm turning this on and off from the UI, is it implementing those splits, right? That configuration.
Yeah.
Right
So
at that moment?
let's get back to that, because that's going to be part of the setup and how we kind of work with this, right? So once you have your split set up, you can configure each split to do a couple of different things, right? So depending on how you want to use the module, you can determine whether you need to do a full split or a kind of a portion of the split. And the names of those exact settings are failing me right now, but basically.
Yeah. So like one allows you to say, hey, this, for example, this entire module and everything related to it is going to be put in this particular bucket. The other one is basically saying, hey, I want this module on both, but I want this particular setting of the module to change depending on which split it's in.
Yeah, so there it's complete split and conditional split, which makes complete sense, huh? Pun intended. So the complete split would be something like Devel, for example. You only want Devel in your development environment, right? So I would say this is going to be a complete split, and I'm going to add it to my development configuration split. A conditional split could be the performance settings, because on my production site, I want my performance, I want my cache to be turned on, I want my aggregation to be turned on. But in development and local, I don't want those settings. So that's going to be a conditional split based on the environment. Once you go through and set up each one of your splits with those settings, depending on how you want the split to operate, you can save that. Once you save that, all that does is update the split. It does not do anything about changing the split. It does not do anything about enabling the split, unless you select the active checkbox for that split.
And to be clear, when you say save to a split, what it does is it creates a new folder in your configuration directory and moves the configuration files to folder.
Yeah, I was going to get to that in just a second. So once the configuration is active, we've typically found that clearing the cache is necessary. So once you activate a configuration, clearing the cache is a good way to go. Also, once you switch between splits, clearing the cache is important. So like, because we're doing our configuration activation through settings.php, we'll actually update our settings.php file, clear the cache. And then at that point, you want to go to your development configuration synchronization screen in Drupal. And here, there are also drush commands. We'll talk about those in a second when we get to kind of the server side stuff. And here, once you get to the synchronize configuration screen, you'll actually notice that it calls out what split it's using. It says, hey, I'm using the production split, or I'm using the local split. And then it'll give you a list of all of the configuration that if you were to import it, what would change. And it actually basically shows you on that screen a diff of the config file as well. So you can say, oh, okay, right now I'm actually looking at a site. It has a config split set. And if I import the config, it's actually going to change the max age on the cache. So it's going to actually enable caching for me.
Is the config split configuration stored where in the database, or is it?
It is stored in the database until you do an export, and then it's stored in your configuration. So
let me go through this, because I recently installed config split and set it up for the first time about 2 weeks ago, and this was a major point of confusion for me. So I think in order to understand this, we need to take a step back for a second and talk about config synchronization, which is the core module that handles this. So if you remember, when we first started the show, we mentioned that the configuration management initiative was in charge of handling configuration. What we didn't mention is one of the first things that initiative did was move all of the configuration from the Drupal's database, which is why we had to use features and strong and all that stuff, into code. So that all of the Drupal configuration now is in a YAML file. Everything was great. The problem was it was extremely slow, because every time Drupal needed to do something with configuration, it had to load a file and read it. And so it was super slow. So what the configuration management team did, and I think this ended up being much better, is they still store all the configuration in the database because it's fast, but they have a process for exporting and importing, aka synchronizing, the files to the database. So what happens is when you create a split and you save it, like I said, we mentioned earlier, it saves it to a new file or a new folder so that it can track that this configuration is different. When you change which split you're using in the UI or in settings.php, all it does is tell the system, hey, you need to be looking at these particular files. But Drupal is still using the configuration that's in the database. So if you change between one split and another, you change it, it's now looking at a new set of files, and it looks at them and goes, oh, these files are different than what I have in my database. Here's what will change when you import it. But nothing will be imported until you click that synchronization button or use the drush command. Once you've done that and clear cache, you're now using the new split. So what this means is if you, we can talk about the way I set it up a little bit in a minute, because it's a little bit different than the way John and his company does. But say you need to make a change to production, the production split. You can't make the change to the production split, export it, change to production, save it, and push it up. What you need to do is you need to basically switch to the production split, run configuration synchronization, clear the cache, then make the change that you need to make, export that configuration, commit that code, and then you can push it up and you've made changes. Then on your local machine, you need to switch back to dev and do everything in reverse. Switch to dev, run the import or the synchronization, and clear cache. So every time you're switching splits, you need to run an import and you need to clear cache. Because when you switch which split you're looking at, either in settings.php or in the UI, all you're doing is telling Drupal, you're looking at this set of files for your source instead of this other set. Sure. It doesn't do anything to change the database.
I guess that was a major point of confusion. The one thing that I want you to clarify is I can sit on my dev machine and configure the production settings.
You can. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, you can. Yep. You can configure any split from within another split. And getting back into your question before about the folder structure. The way that config split manages your folder structure for configuration is it actually creates when you set up a split, you assign that split a folder within your config folder. And what the config split module does is it has a common folder, which is configuration that's used for all the splits, every site. And then each configuration split has its own folder where specific configuration is stored. So when you get this installed,
once you install this, you're not using the existing configuration syncing screen.
No, there's subfolders.
You are, yeah. There's subfolders within your configuration.
Gotcha.
Well, they don't have to be, I don't think, actually, but they should. There's no reason
for organization. I mean, to be honest, you can do whatever you want, as with like anything in Drupal, right? But for organization and keeping things straight, making them a subfolder of your configuration folder makes a lot of sense.
We're gonna get hate mail now saying I have my splits in files. But no, it's you can point it wherever you want. I think best practices though is to make them subfolders of the config folder.
As with anything, I recommend playing with it because you really get to understand it a lot better once you get in there and you start seeing how these things are set up and how you can export and import.
It's very straightforward. The only gotcha that I had was when you're switching between splits and making changes, you have to import it after, and you have to clear cache, which means if you're working on dev stuff and then something, you get a ticket or something, like say you make some change, you're working on developing the site, you added a couple of fields and stuff, and then somebody comes in, hey, we have a priority issue on production, you need to make this change. You need to export your current config, commit it, so it's in the dev branch that you have, I have the you have that stuff stored somewhere. Then you have to switch to the production split. You have to import it and you have to make the changes. Then you have to export it, save it, and push it up. It's not. You have to be a little bit more careful when you're switching between splits than other things in Drupal. But it's pretty straightforward once you get used to it.
So I think that's a great point as well. When you're exporting config and you're committing it, you also want to be careful of the paths that are set up, because that's another way that you can kind of see which config is being saved and where your config changes are being stored. And that kind of helps you to visualize like, okay, I made production config changes. Oh, all of these files that I've now come to know as configuration files that I need are being stored in the production folder, which makes sense because this split only applies to production, or this config only applies to production. One thing I don't know that we talked about are the drush commands for exporting and importing.
I think just that they're there is fine, right? So we can use drush to import and export them. Look up the commands.
Yeah, drush config export, or CEX is the alias, and then drush config import, or CIM is the alias. I see in our notes here somebody put -y after those. I would say don't use it with the -y unless you really know what you're doing, because what that command is going to do is drush is going to look to see if there's any config, and then it's going to show you the config that is updating in a list of file names. Doesn't do it. This is one thing where drush is not as elaborate as the UI, which is kind of odd, but looking at that list sometimes can tell you whether you actually want to export or import the config or not. So I would just use the -y with caution.
Yeah, I mean, I personally use the -y because I review it when I'm adding it to the repo, and I don't feel like going through that list twice. So you should just say export everything, and then when I do git add -up, I make sure that it has the config that I want.
Hey, are there any gotchas? Any other gotchas that you people should look out for here?
I think the cache clearing is probably one of the bigger ones, because you'll go to import a split and you'll be like, why doesn't this work? And it's simply because you haven't cleared the cache. Right. I will say I don't know that the cache clearing is necessary if you're using the UI specifically, but just be aware.
Yeah. I think there's one other, and I think it's the only real complaint that I have about config split. And that is on both of the modes of splitting. So like we said, you can do a full split, which is like, say, hey, this entire module, or you can do a conditional split where you choose individual variables. They're both just these gigantic lists, select lists, which they have to be because there's hundreds of options. But it would be nice if there was some sort of multi-select type functionality, so you could because like right now it's basically like you have to like, you can only see 4 or 5 at a time, so you end up scrolling forever and then holding control and hoping you didn't accidentally click and deselect all the 35
Sounds
other
like a
things
great
that you
area
have
for improvement.
It's the only downside I've seen so far. And one of the things that I do to mitigate it, which is a little bit different than, as I alluded to earlier, I think John's process is one of the more straightforward processes where you have, a dev split, a stage split, and a production split, and local split, whatever else you need, and you just set all that functionality there. What I ended up doing for the client that I recently set up for is I set a dev split and eventually a stage split once I need it, but that sets things like all of the options that we need. And then what I did was I set the default of the site is production. So basically, if you don't explicitly say this is dev, then everything defaults to the settings that you need for production. So that way, for example, instead of having a split to turn caching on, caching is just always on, and then the dev split turns caching off explicitly. So that way, if something happens on production and when it's deploying and the production split doesn't get set, or somebody updates the settings.php manually and removes that variable, you won't suddenly have a production site that has no caching and has, something else in the title and other changes. It's basically, if there's the settings.php doesn't have to have anything right now because there's no split active, and it will just set the production values. I think it's probably a way to kind of fail safely. Like, it doesn't, you don't have to worry about if that variable doesn't get set, then XML sitemap isn't turned on, and all that stuff that if it goes down for a little while, Google might read the site and go, hey, there's a problem here. So that's kind of just the philosophy I've taken. It may change in the future because this is still relatively new, but it's an approach that I'm trying.
Hey, so if anyone has any use cases for config split that we haven't mentioned today, you could let us know about them, and we'll pass those on in the next episode. You could email us at show@talkingdrupal.com, and we'll include those in our next show. Hey, anything else, guys, before we close out today?
Yeah, I got a breaking news update here from the security team. Apparently, Drupal core has a critical issue, multiple vulnerabilities that just came out today, actually, just now. So there are multiple vulnerabilities, so I'm not going to read them all, but the large one here is that users are with the ability to post comments are able to view content and comments they do not have access to, and may also be able to add comments to them.
This is in core? I don't see it on
the but that's not even the big one, because most people don't even have comments enabled. The check plain JavaScript function doesn't properly sanitize HTML. That sounds like just a slight issue.
Yeah, so that's the second one. Yep, and then private files bypass.
Where are you guys reading this? Because if you go to
it's on the
Drupal.org/security, these aren't up there yet.
Yeah,
Oh,
no, that's where I
here,
just get the email.
I can send you a link.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll put it in there.
We'll put it in the show notes. But yes, so use
I'll be
config
right back. I'm gonna go update.
I just got page not found and I went to that link.
Really?
Weird.
Yeah.
Huh.
No,
I get
no,
a
I get it.
404. Did you paste it wrong?
Nope, I just went to it.
I'll paste the one. That's the same one.
I can't
So anyway, use config split and update your Drupal sites. Let that be today's lesson.
All right.
All right.
Now I need to.
All right, guys. So we get
Go
some work
update
to do when we get off the phone.
Yes, and it's Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. So
Yeah. All right, John
Update
Picozzi,
all
where can
the
people
Drupal.
find you online?
Oh man, you can find me so many places. You can find me next month, March 17th, at the Nerd Summit in Western Mass. I will be speaking there. You can find me on all the social networks, Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find me at Oomph Inc. If you're a developer looking for a job, go to Oomph Inc. and check out our job sections. We are looking for some web engineers.
Excellent. How about you, Nick?
do you call those web engineers?
Web engineers?
No, we don't mash it together. We pronounce each word separately.
Imagineers like Disney?
Yeah. You you can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixman, NICXVAN, except for Facebook.
Exactly. And I'm Stephen Cross at Stephen Cross, still on Twitter. Talk to you guys next week.
See you guys later.
Have a good one.